So in today's platform technologies lecture, we are going to continue with our discussions into various topics, various concepts that are fundamental to building larger platforms. Uh, so today's topic is going to be security. Uh, so security is a very vast topic area when we are considering computing. So we will not be able to cover a lot of things today. It is just a single lesson in this course. Um, but we will cover some of the basic concepts that you need to be aware of about security when we are considering operating system environments, networked computers, and so on. So we'll cover some of the basics, and then we may also touch upon some of these in some of the practical lessons that we may cover later in the course. But other than that, keep in mind that this is only a basic introductory lesson into security, and you may even be interested in some of these, and you could do a lot of self-studying in some of these areas as well. So, when we think about security in a computing environment, when we think about security, it could be with a single computer, like a narrow down into a single computer, or larger environments of larger network computing environments. We would still have a similar set of goals in terms of what we want to achieve in terms of security. So the three main goals that we would identify are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So confidentiality is about exposure of data. So say you have some data that belongs to you, and confidentiality would be, I should not be able to access your data without your permission. So for example, I could be a teacher and I have some resources in my computer, some files in my computer that are about student results, exam results. So that is a piece of data where I expect certain level of confidentiality. I don't want these results released to anyone else. So in that case, anybody else accessing them is a breach of confidentiality. So what we want to ensure is, if a particular piece of information, particular piece of data, or a resource has a limitation in terms of who can know about it, then only those people should know about it, and others should not be able to access that data. Integrity is not about access of data, it is about what happens to the data and if the data remains unchanged as expected. Say for example, again, if I have stored some exam results on my computer and so I have tabulated the exam results for the list of students, I have stored them in my computer. So now here I expect the exam results as I stored initially should remain as it is for a later period of time as well. So nobody should be able to come in and see that, but also even if they come in, they should not have modified that data. So say if somebody goes and changes their results, for example, that is a breach of integrity, because the integrity of the data is affected there. So it could be they are changing the data, they are removing some data, or they are adding some additional data. So all of these things, if they happen without the permission of the owner, then that is the problem. So in both these cases, we will consider the data belonging to somebody, and they can decide whether the data can change or not, or somebody else can access the data or not. But without their permission, these things should not happen. And the third goal that we would have is about availability. So one of the things about security is, say you have some information on a computer, and then you expect that information to be available to you at any time that you want that information. So, for example, if I have saved that exam results on my computer, I should be able to see that information at a later time when I want to see it. So, if, for example, if somebody is not able to access it, so the confidentiality is protected. If they are not able to access and modify the data, their integrity is also protected. But if they can still make me not access the data, say if they steal my computer, or if they do something to the computer so that the access to the information is disabled, so the information is no longer available to me. So that is also a breach of security. So if somebody can make that system behave in a way that it is not providing the information as needed, information or services or any of the resources as needed, then we will call that denial of service. So that is a problem that we would face, particularly in larger computing environments, because sometimes it may not be possible to breach into the systems to violate confidentiality or integrity, but they may be able to render the systems unresponsive or not working properly. So even people who need to access the system can't access it. So that is also a problem in the context of security. So these three things we would identify as the basic goals that we would have in any security environment, considering any type of computing environment. So one of the basic points where we can start thinking about security is operating system security. So as we initially identified, operating systems are going to be the foundation of our computing environments. Any platforms that we build, however large they may be, there is going to be the underlying layer of the operating system. So any security mechanism that we build also should start from the foundation layer there. So we have to protect every part of the system. So given operating systems are the foundation layer, we have to protect them as well. They should have certain security measures. But when considering operating systems, we would identify, like even if you think about your own computers, for example, you can easily see one of the most common ways the security of these systems can be compromised is not through sophisticated means. Say, for example, you may have a easily guessable password or a PIN number. So if somebody is guessing your password or a PIN number, you have used your date of birth as your password, or 1 2 3 4 5 6 as your PIN number. So if you do things like that, and humans tend to do these things fairly commonly, then it is not a fault of the security systems or failing of the technical security system per se, because it is not a sophisticated technical attack that is happening, but it is still compromising the security of the system. So even things like social engineering, where human behavior is exploited. So for example, you may use say, for example, let's take the example of an online system. You have a password and an email that you need to log into the system. But then that password can be reset using, for example, say some security questions. Then the security questions are about where you were born, the name of your mother, and something like that. I mean, maybe name of your pet or something. Then if somebody wants to reset the password and gain access to that account, all they need to know is they don't need to know your password. Maybe they need to know your email address or your username. And if they can guess these other answers to those questions, and in many cases, those answers can be fairly easily guessed. Say, a good example could be if I go into one of your social media networks, there you may have posted about your hometown, maybe you may have posted something about having a pet and the name of your pet. And so if only thing is I need to go through a social media and like try to find more information, and at some point I would find a lot of information that can be used in an attack like this. So this is again is not a technically sophisticated attack. It is not compromising any problems in the system, but it is exploiting some human behavior. So that is what we call as social engineering. But leaving these type of attacks aside, these non-technical, non-sophisticated attacks aside, operating systems are still going to be vulnerable to a lot of sophisticated technical attacks. So we have to think about those as well. So we can't just say all the attacks are going to be these type of non-sophisticated attacks. There will be a lot of targeted, sophisticated attacks as well, trying to get through passwords using some technical measures, trying to break through encryptions and so on. So there will be some targeted attacks on the security framework of the operating system. So we will have to think about those as well. So we will look at some of the approaches, how these threats can come along, and what are some of the countermeasures that we can take in terms of protecting ourselves from these type of attacks. So when considering these security attacks, attacks on operating systems, on our computing systems, we can again categorize them into two broader categories. So the first one is what we call as passive attacks. And passive attacks are type of attacks where the attack is happening on the computing system, on the computing environment, and some harm is happening, but that attack is running in the background. So the user or the end user, say if you are the end user of the computer system, you are not aware of that attack happening. Say for example, there is a malware that is running on the computer that is tracking all the keyboard typing that you are making. So from that they can take your username, passwords, credit card details and so on. But that system is running in the background. That attack is happening in the background, and you as the user is not aware of that. The second type of attack is what we call as active attacks. And active attacks will make the computing system misbehave, and you as the user will know that the attack is now happening. So for example, they may take control of your system, they may encrypt your hard drive, they may run a virus that is deleting files in your system. So you as the user will know that this attack is happening. So these are, whatever the attacks that we have, we can categorize them into these two categories. One, passive attacks that are running in the background of the system, and you will not know much about them until very late, until a lot of harm has happened. And then active attacks, again, they will do a lot of harm, but you may know about them maybe in a bit more advanced, because once they start doing harm, they will show some symptoms that you can see. Say if they encrypt the hard drive or they delete files in your hard drive, you will see, okay, these files are missing, so something is going wrong in the system. So that is the main difference between passive attacks and active attacks. Now we can ask an important question here, that is, can we build secure systems? So we have various types of attacks that can happen, but can we always protect ourselves against all types of attacks? So say we have some passive attacks happening, we have some active attacks happening, some are targeted at the operating system, some are targeting other things. So in that situation, can we build a system where we can say it is 100% secure? Is it possible to say that we have built this system and no attacks can happen in the system? The problem is, on a theoretical level, it would be possible to build a software as bug-free, a software without any vulnerabilities, a software without any problems, so it can protect itself from all the possible attacks. But the reality is, particularly in the type of computer systems that we have today, we have a lot of computer systems that are very much complicated. So we have these operating systems, we have a lot of application software, and a lot of other software that would run in these systems. So we have a lot of moving pieces, a lot of pieces of software, and a lot of these software are complicated on their own. So what we would end up is software systems that are with a lot of complication, and that in turn would lead to a lot of potential for vulnerabilities. So and also some other reasons. Say, for example, we may have operating systems and then there will be updates coming to these systems, and not everybody would update the systems. Some people may update these systems and some people may not update these systems. So there are a number of reasons. So one, we have more complicated systems, more feature-rich systems, and that in turn results in us having more possibilities for vulnerabilities and more possibilities for them being exploited and attacks happening from a security point of view. So given the fact that we cannot have computer systems that are 100% secure, then we need to have some level of confidence in the system. We can't say, okay, we can't have any security, so we are going to just leave it at that. So that is not a solution to have there. So what we can have is, so 100% security is not possible. No security is also not an option. We can't say like, I don't want any security is also not an option. So what we can have is what is called a trusted computing base. So for our requirement, say for example, for this type of an organization, let's take an example of a bank. For a bank, they may have certain requirements in terms of their security, considering confidentiality, integrity, availability, and all these things. They may have certain level of requirements. So this should not happen, this should not happen, this should happen. So they can have a list of requirements. So once we identify that requirements for that particular environment, that particular platform computing system, then we can say if the computing system that we have can meet those requirements, then that is a trusted system. So we will define this trusted computing base, a basic level foundational requirements. So as long as those requirements are met, we will say this system is a trusted system. So we are not saying it is 100% secure, but we are saying it is catering the requirements that we have specified as the trusted computing base. So we will define that set of requirements. We will define the basic specification to say these are the things that should happen. And then as long as those things are happening, we will say the system is trusted, or the system can be trusted now. So that is what we can achieve when we are considering what is possible in terms of security. We cannot have 100% security, but we can have some level of security that is acceptable for our needs. So now when we look at our security goals of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, all of these things are about who can access the information, who can access the computer system, and what they can do with that. So should they access, can they access, and if they access, what they can do. So these are some of the considerations that we have when we are considering our basic security goals, our basic security requirements. So with that in mind, what we can say is controlling access to these resources will be the basic thing that we will have to do when we want to enact security in our system. So by controlling access to resources, we can in many ways achieve our goals of security. So if we can control who can and cannot access, who can and cannot read a file, then we can ensure confidentiality there. Similarly, integrity and availability can also be linked back to who can access that resource or not. So when considering our computer systems, we can consider files, resources, or any of these, even certain hardware systems and all, we can consider them as things that can be accessed or not. So we will normally identify all these things together as objects. So any files, hardware systems, anything, any resource that can be accessed, we will identify them as objects. And the goal of access control, the goal of controlling access is deciding who is allowed to access this system and under what conditions they can access the system. Say, for example, we can say a student can access this system, but they can only read the file. They cannot modify the file. If there is a exam results file somewhere, then they can see the exam results, but they should not be able to change the exam results. Whereas certain other users may have the capability of changing the results. So that is what we may do in terms of controlling access. So there are a few different ways that we can do access control. We will look at sort of three basic ways here. One is protection domains, access control lists, and capabilities. So we will look at each of these individually. But in all of these mechanisms, the main goal is deciding this is the resource that we have, these are the users that we have, and how we are mapping which user is able to access which resource under what conditions. Say, students can read, teachers can modify. So likewise, we can have that type of rules here. So that is what we try to do with these type of different access control mechanisms. So we will look into each of. So first category of access control that we can, a mechanism that we can see is what is called a protection domain. So in protection domain, what we have is, we have, say, we will identify domains. So domains can be, so what the type of access privileges are grouped together in a domain. So we can have few different access domains. And for each access domain, we can specify a pair of object and rights. So we will go into each domain and specify a pair of object and rights. So for example, we can say in domain 1, file 1 can be read. It has read access. In domain 3, we have a plotter device that can be written, write access is there. In domain 2, we have file 4 that has read, write, and execute privileges, execute permission. So what we have here is, in each of these conditions, each of these cases, we have different types of privileges. So we have read permissions in certain situations. So some are read permissions, and in some other cases we have write and execute permissions. So what we have is, we will specify some object, so a file or a printer or a plotter device. So that is the object part, and the rights part is whether it is read, read write, read, write, execute, only write. So likewise, we can have that as well. So in this condition, in this if this condition is met, that particular access can be allowed. So for example, we can do this in the case of, say, in a Linux Unix type file system. The concept of domain can be similar to a user ID or a group ID. So what we can say is, say student 1, say student 1 can do these things. So we can give access for an individual user basis, or we can say all teachers can do this. So either it can be a single user or a group of users, but the basic idea is we give permissions in the form of this, a pair of objects and rights. So file 1, what they can do, file 2, what they can do. So for each of these individual users or groups of users, we will say what they can do to each of the objects that are available in the system. So that is protection domains. Another mechanism for access control is what we call as access control lists. So here what we have is, for each of the files or each of the objects, so we will start with the objects, and for each of the objects we will go and say what can be done, what are the permissions allowed for each of the objects. So we would say for file 1, it is allowed for user A or process A can do read and write. B can do only read. Similarly, we can say for file 2, A can read, B can read, write, and C can read. And maybe for file 3, we can go and say B can read, write, execute, and C can read and execute. So again, here what we have is a group of permissions, but the permissions are now assigned to individual objects. So in the case of protection domains, the permissions are assigned to users or groups of users, for example, the domains, and permissions are pairs of objects and rights. In access control list, permissions are assigned to objects or files, and the pairs are users or processors or owners and their rights. So it is just a different way of associating, because as we said, we have to somehow associate which user can do what action on which file. So these are the 3 parameters that we have to think about. Who can do what on which file. So if these are the 3 things, we can put them in few different orders. So access control list is another way of doing it. And the third one is again a slight variation from access control list. This is called capabilities or capability list. So here what we associate is, we start with the users and then say what they can do with each of the files. So this is somewhat similar to the concept of protection domains, but we will be doing it for individual users. So this is somewhat can be seen as sort of a middle ground or combination between the previous 2. So again, the same concepts apply. So B can do these things and C can do these things. So again, we are combining these different capabilities with users. So those 3 ways are how we can do access control. So in access control, what we try to do is, we said student can read results file. Teacher can modify or write results file. Students and teachers can print from the printer or write to the printer. So these are what we said people can do. So there are resources, there are certain actions that can be done on those resources, and we will say who can be associated with those resources and actions. So We used 3 different ways of doing that. Then, if we consider that as a starting point, now we have a question to answer. Say, for example, you are saying, you are coming into the computer system and saying, I am a student, please let me see this thing. Or I am a teacher, please let me modify this file. So now, how the system can know that you are the student, you are a student. So maybe if you are a student and you come and say, I'm a teacher, how could the system differentiate between you and the actual teacher? So that is the question that we will answer by authentication. So access control is about the rights. It is about who can do what. Authentication is about the computer system knowing who people say they are. Say, if you say you are a student, how do we know you are a student? Then we will have some mechanisms to identify you, and that is the part of authentication. So it is to identify who a particular user is and if they are claiming to be the right person. And we would do authentication using 3 major principles. So one is, so again, authentication is something that you would be fairly familiar with, but we would put that in this context here as these 3 principles. So the first one is something the user knows. So this is when you are authenticating into a system using something like a password or a PIN number. So that is something that you know, and the assumption is only you would know the password. So your password is private to you. You are not sharing the password with anyone else. Say if I am a teacher, I have a password to the system, and if I give my name and my password, and if that is correct, the system would assume Nimal is a teacher, and given that they have given the password, then the person who is logging into the system must be Nimal, and now they can have all the privileges as a teacher. But at the same time, I can use some other approaches as well. So password is a basic way of authenticating, but other approaches are something that the user has. So these are things like smart cards or RFID cards, things like that. Some hardware or a piece of device that you can carry around, and by having that device, again, ensures that you are able to access the system. So for example, if we consider physical spaces, even certain computer systems, you may be asked to plug in a smart card. And if you have a smart card, and if you can use it in the system, then that can be assumed, we can assume that it is usable like that. Something that the user has. And the third category is something that the user is. So these are more about our personal factors. So things like fingerprints, biometrics, so eye scans, facial scans, and so on. So these are about what are things that we have inherently. So once we have these things, again, these can be used for authentication. So only I can have my fingerprint unless somebody cut my finger and take it away. So other than that, I will have my finger. So these are 3 primary ways that we would use to authenticate users or to identify who the users are and is it the same as they're claiming to be. So access control is about the rules, about saying who can do what. Authentication is about who these people are and are they claiming to be the right people. So that is the main difference between access control and authentication. Hello? Oh? මේකට සල්ලි දෙන්න සල්ලි දීලා නැහැ නේ. apartment එක ඉස්සරහයි මම එතන මේ ඔයාට apartment එක ඇතුළට යන්න පුළුවන්ද? එහෙම ප්‍රශ්නයක් පොඩ්ඩක් ඉන්න එහෙනම් මට විනාඩි 5ක් වගේ දෙනවා මම එන්න පල්ලෙහාට. So, when we consider authentication, one of the simple ways of authentication that you would have been familiar with and you would use a lot is simple password type authentication. So, we can sort of categorize this as a challenge response authentication, for example. Some of the variations of challenge response authentication are like passwords, or even things like asking for answers for questions. So, like as sort of previously mentioned, things about personal details about you, like a place of birth and so on. So you may have predefined those. So again, it is a challenge response. So like asking for password, instead they can ask for some of these questions. You may have predefined some questions and they may ask from one of these questions. So again, all of these are what we can identify as challenge response authentication. But when we consider authentication as a whole, using only one of these approaches, or only using passwords, or only using challenge response questions, may not be so secure, because either passwords can be guessed, or there can be a number of problems. So that is why what we would see is the best authentication mechanism that we can have would be where we are using multiples of these approaches. Say, for example, we use a challenge response mechanism like a password option, and then we also ask them to scan their fingerprint. So if we do that combination, then it becomes even more difficult. So then we can even do that at the next level of having, say, asking for a password or a PIN number and asking them to swipe a smart card and a fingerprint, for example. So now we do the three. So then that can be even more difficult for someone to spoof, or someone to break into, because like they have to do various actions about each of these aspects to break into that. So that could be even more difficult. So that is why we would prefer not to use only one of the approaches, and particularly password type approaches are the most weakest in many ways. So then we have to think about how we can combine these different approaches together when we are authenticating into systems. So now, when we think about authentication and access control, it is mainly about keeping certain people away from our system. So we want to keep certain people outside the system. So we don't want them to coming into the system. But we can categorize, or we can look into these people who are trying to attack our system, who are trying to intrude into our computing system. Again, we will see few different types of people that are trying to do this. So the first category of people that we may see quite a bit is what we can identify as casual users. So these are most of the time non-technical users that can sort of occasionally stumble onto these systems. So for example, you may have someone in your office environment, in an office environment, maybe a colleague, maybe someone working in a different department, who are not supposed to see a particular system. Or in the case of a university, a student may go into an area of the lecturer, teachers or lecturers, and they may stumble upon computers that are being used by those parties. So they stumble upon to these systems. They have some ability to see these systems, and they are not doing any technical aspects into breaking into the system. They are sort of casually coming across this information, and they may do something with that. So that is the first category of users. Then the second category is what we can call as insiders. So these are again insiders who are sort of again have some capability. Say for example, if you are a person who is working in a telecommunication service provider, and you work in a particular department, but you have access to the systems that have the call logs of the whole customers. Then if you go and look into the call logs of a particular customer, your friend or your enemy or someone, then that is something that we can identify as snooping by insiders. They should not access the system. I mean, like, they technically have access to the system, but they should not be doing that in that particular case. But they are still doing it. So that is what we can call as snooping by insider. And the third category is what we can identify as, again, people, but here they are determined to make money. So there's some intention about making money here. So this is not just about randomly going about and finding some information, but there is some serious motive about making money here. So that is the third category of people. So these are determined people who are trying to make some money by using some attacks or coming into a system. The fourth category is what we can identify as commercial or military espionage. These are large corporations who may try to get into the systems of their competitors, or on the other hand, governments trying to get into other governments. So these are some of the cases that we can identify as sort of large-scale intruders, for example. Of these four categories, what we can see is the first two are more not so sophisticated, more non-technical ways of attacking the systems, or maybe even insiders. They may not do a lot of sophisticated things there, and also their intentions are slightly different. Whereas the last two are more intended to do harm. They have a purpose, either making money, stealing trade secrets, stealing government secrets, and so on. So not all attacks are going to happen from the same level of complexity or the same type of people. Some people are randomly stumbling upon your system and getting access to the system. Some people are coming with a particular motive to do certain harm. So we will have to think about these things also when we are thinking about what are the type of security risks that we are facing in our system. Say, for example, if we are building a system for a government, we may have to think about what are some of these challenges that may come from other governments. Like, say, another country's government may have some interest to break into a government system. So we may have to consider those things and have our securities much more sophisticated as well to match that problem. So now when we consider the systems that we use, any sort of computer system that we would use, when we are considering type of security attacks that can happen in that system, we can look at what is called the attack surface, or attack surfaces in a particular system. So attack surface is the type of thing or a possibility from where an attack can happen. So for an attack to happen in a computer system, in a computing environment, there should be some vulnerability that can be exploited. So we will have to identify these attack surfaces. What are some of the ways that people can attack our system? Then only we can think about the precautions that we can take. Say, for example, if it is a network connected system, then there is a possibility that attacks can come through the network. But if it is not a network connected system, then that may not be a possibility. But then, say, for example, if it is if the system is exposed to outside users in a certain manner, then that can also be an attack surface. So what are some of the ways that these attacks can happen? So if it is a web server, if it is a server that is connected to the website, then any sort of external requests that are coming into that can be an attack surface like that. So we have to think about what are the possible ways that an attack can happen, and we have to think about all the different aspects of the systems as well. So that is why we will categorize, or we will look into mainly sort of 3 different ways of attack surfaces. One is network attack surface, software attack surface, and human attack surface. So network attack surface is any type of attacks that can happen against any vulnerabilities related to network connectivity. So if they are connected to the local area network, if they are connected to a wide area network, or even to the internet, then by that connectivity, what are some of the vulnerabilities and what are some of the problems that we may encounter because of that particular aspect. Then software attack surface is about, if we would be using a number of software in any platform that we build. Say we would have the underlying operating system, and then we would have a number of application software, server software, and so on. So all these different software systems, they can have some vulnerabilities, they can have some problems, bugs in the systems that can be exploited and somebody can get into the system. So that is the software attack surface. And the third one is the human attack surface. So that is considering any users, any people who are interacting with the system, and what are some of the vulnerabilities that can be created with that. So these are things about social engineering. Say if you are an employee of an organization, maybe an outsider may try to learn about your access credentials and try to access the system without you knowing. Or it could be an insider who is working against the organization. So maybe an outsider will come and pay you some money and ask you to get some information for them. So that is also a possibility that we have to consider when we are considering possible attacks against the security. So we have to think about, say, if it is a network connected system, think about the network connectivity and those possibilities. Any system, we will have to think about the software layer and what are the vulnerabilities there. And we will always have to think about the human users and what they can do, what they can do wrong in the system. So these are some of the various possibilities that we have to think about, and then we can try to address for focusing on each of these possibilities, because considering each of these cases, we may identify different types of attacks that can happen. So in network surface, some attacks are possible, like DOS attacks or DDoS attacks or intrusion attacks. In software surface, we can look at certain malware, viruses, and so on. In human attacks, we can think about social engineering, insider attacks, and so on. So we can, if we know these different attack surfaces and what is possible, then we can start looking at what are the solutions to these problems, these attacks. So for example, when we consider network surfaces, for example, here we can identify some of the common attacks and some of the common countermeasures that we can do there. So the first one is, if people are trying to get into the system, just randomly trying to getting into the system. So if they are just scanning to see what is possible to exploit in this system, and then we can have firewalls as a solution there. Say if they are trying to exploit certain bugs in the software systems, in the network software, say server software, if they are trying to exploit and trying to get into the system like that, there we may have some intrusion detection systems as a solution. Then similarly, say for example, denial of service attacks or TCP hijacking, packet sniffing, social problems. So we can have a number of different possibilities for attacks, and for each of these we can have different types of solutions. So in the context of this course, we are not going into detail of these solutions because that is a more security oriented problem, but just being aware of some of these problems, you can start thinking about these problems when you are faced with a situation, when you're building a larger platform environment. You can start thinking about some of these problems and some of these solutions or countermeasures there. Say one of the common problems that can happen in particularly in network computing environments, in larger platform environments, is a denial of service attack. So the basic idea behind denial of service attacks is uh, an authorized user, say if you are the user who is allowed to access the system, you are no longer able to access the system because the system is not responding as it should be. So uh, if somebody can say flood the network, say you need to access a server, that server can handle 1,000 requests per second. But if somebody else is sending 1,000 requests per second, then your request may not be answered there. So any legitimate user will not be able to access the system because these other attack requests are flooding the system. So there are a number of ways these type of denial of service attacks can happen. And one of the other sort of variation of denial of service attacks is what is called a distributed denial of service attack. So the main difference being, say, in a denial of service attack, the attack will come from a single destination. So say one server will, so the attack will be launched from a single point. Whereas in a distributed denial of service attack, the attack can be launched from multiple parties, say multiple botnets and so on. They may launch an attack towards the server, and the server is not able to distinguish between different requests, legitimate correct request and attack requests. So this is a common attack that you may encounter in a networked computing environment. Then in the context of say software environments, we may come across malware, so malicious software. So these are pieces of software that spread across the internet, and things like, say, ransomware that may encrypt a user's hard drive, and then it would ask for money to decrypt the hard drive to release the files. Then we can have spyware. Again, these are software that will run in the background of the computer, and they will try to steal information like passwords and financial information and so on. So these are also some of the challenges when considering sort of software type of attacks. Then when we are considering humans, we can think about insider attacks. So a person who is working inside the organization, because they will have much more possibility of attacking the system, there are a few ways this can happen. So people can build what is called logic bombs. So if you are a programmer, you may program the system so that the program will only work as long as you are an employee in this organization. So every day you will go and put a password, or if you are still employee in the employee system, it will check those things and then let the system run. Then if you are no longer an employee and you don't give your password every day, then the system will detect that you are no longer an employee, and most likely you are fired from the organization. So then what it would do is it would disable the system. It would say, for example, it would delete all the files in the servers. It may send the files to a remote server and delete everything in the local server. So something like that. Or it could, for example, disable the system after 5 years. So some form of logic, and then it will attack. So the code that is relevant to that attack is already in the system, but it only comes alive under certain logical conditions. So that is what we call as logic bombs. Then we can have other sort of variation is what is called backdoors. Again, this is some additional programming that has been put into the system by again a programmer. But for example, if you are building a system, you say if I input this username and this password, let me into the system without checking anything, and let me be the administrator of the system. So because that is a piece of code that you have written in the system, then it is not going to check the database for the correct username or a password. So that is also a possibility there. So there are a few different ways these type of insider attacks can happen, and we should be mindful of that as well. So because particularly insider attacks are much more dangerous because people have a lot of information about the systems. They may actually have some serious problems with the organization, because if you are fired from the organization, if you are not given a promotion. So these are some of the situations where these type of attacks can happen. So even if we build all the much secure systems to protect from outside environments, firewalls and everything. If we have these insider threats, we have to think about those as well. And as I said, social engineering is again going to be another problem. So this is where people are going to ask you for personal information. One of the common things that is happening these days, like you may have received these information from your banking providers or internet, if you have internet banking and so on, you may have received messages saying, even if somebody calls from the banks and says they are from the bank, don't give them any information, because that is a very typical kind of an attack. And this happens a lot, and a lot of people fall victim to this, because they may call and say, I am calling from the administration department, there's a problem with your system, your account, you are not being able to log into the system, so this is your username, or can you tell me your username and password, and I will check from my end. And if they sound like very authoritative and sound very sort of decent, you may think, okay, that must be someone from the IT department or admin department. You will give the details that they are asking for, and then they can use that to log into the system and do whatever the harm that they intend to do. So these are some of the things that we have to be mindful as well. So, and that is something that every user should be mindful as well, not just these because like social engineering cannot be solved by building secure systems. It also depends on the knowledge of the users as well. So that is also something of importance there. So when we consider defenses or countermeasures to these security problems, there are some solutions that we can think of from a security point of view, from a technical point of view. So there are some solutions that are more non-technical, about user training, people being aware of these things and so on. That is non-technical. But even from a technical point of view, what we would expect is multiple layers of security. So not just having operating system level security. So we should have a password to get into the operating system, some authentication and access control there. Then for each application layer, again, there are some security systems there. So we should have multiple layers of security. So even if one layer of security is breached, the next layer will protect us from an attack. So what we need to have is different layers of security protecting different aspects of a system. So even if one layer fails, the other layer will be there to protect us. So that is what we would try to achieve when we are trying to build a much more secure system. So when we consider, say, a network connected platform server, for example, we may have to build some firewalls there, some access control there, some intrusion detection systems there. Similarly, we may build a number of these different systems as security precautions, security measures. So if one of those things fails, other thing may protect us from any harm. So that is what we would try to do as a measure of countermeasures or defenses. So now let's look at, so we are not going to discuss about the details about various defense mechanisms and so on, because that is a much more involved security discussion. So we are not going to go into that. But we are going to go into one of the mechanisms that is employed in a lot of countermeasures. A lot of these techniques will come across in a lot of different approaches. That is cryptography. So cryptography is a basic mechanism that will be used in a lot of solutions for a lot of types of attacks. So we will look at cryptography in this course, and some of these knowledges will be useful in later courses as well. So the basic idea of cryptography is this: use some mathematical functions, you take an information, you put it through some mathematical function and produce a result that is not eligible. So that is not, if somebody sees that transformed information, they are not going to get anything useful there. Then if they can reverse that mathematical function and get something out of it, they can get the original message there. So that is the basic idea of cryptography. So what we have is, we would start with what is called a plain text. So the plain text is what we would start with, and we would put it through an encryption algorithm. So once we put it through this mathematical encryption algorithm, using an encryption key, we would produce what is called a ciphertext. So this ciphertext is going to be something that is not readily readable. So this ciphertext is like a jumbled text. Say, plain text is something that you can read as a message, but if somebody gets access to the ciphertext, they are not going to get any useful information out of that. Then what we can do is, we can send the ciphertext anywhere, because we don't have to worry about sending the ciphertext or storing the ciphertext, because it will still be secure, because nobody can understand that, unless they have the decryption key and they use that decryption key with the decryption algorithm and they put the ciphertext through that, then it would produce the plain text. So what we would have is, we would start with a plain text, we would put it through the encryption algorithm and produce the ciphertext. And then if we put it through the decryption algorithm, we can get the plain text out. But what we need here is the encryption and decryption keys here. So we will use the encryption key to lock the message, so to speak, and use the decryption key to unlock the message, so to speak. So this type of cryptography approach is very much used in many security applications. So we can use it to, for example, say encrypt files files that are stored in a disk, for example. We can use it in security protocols, in various security protocols in network traffic. We can use it even to protect passwords relevant to authentication mechanisms. So there are various places where we would use this cryptography approach. So cryptography, the underlying concept of cryptography, we will use in many of these approaches. So the basic idea of cryptography is this. We will start with some plain text, convert it into ciphertext, and then convert it back into plain text again. So with cryptography, we can identify two basic types of cryptography. The first one is what we call as secret key cryptography. So with secret key cryptography, that is what we previously identified. What we have is, say, we will start with a plain text. We will start with a plain text, and then we can convert it into a ciphertext. So for the conversion, we need an encryption key. We would need the encryption key for the conversion part there. So we will do the conversion using the encryption key. Then if we want to convert that back into plain text again, then we would need the decryption key there. So the decryption key will be needed for converting it back again. So we should need a decryption key to convert it back into plain text again. With this approach, we have what is called a private key, or rather a secret key, that is the encryption key, and another secret key, that is the decryption key. So this is what we would call as symmetric key cryptography. So we will have two keys, that is, one is for locking and one is for unlocking. And there are some, say, one of the basic mechanisms to do this type of cryptography is what we call as monoalphabetic substitution. So it is not a very complicated cryptography mechanism. So we replace one letter with another letter, and then we need to know what is the replacement we use to get it back to the original text. But this is not a very secure mechanism. So it is a basic cryptography approach, but just to understand how it works. But the main point about this secret key cryptography is they should share, or they should have this key. They should have the key at both ends to do the unlocking. So they should have the shared key at both ends to do the encryption and decryption part. So that is going to be necessary here. So one of the disadvantages with secret key cryptography is we need to share the key again. So for example, if I want to send you a secret message, I should first somehow share the secret key with you. So either we need to meet in person to share the key first, and then we go away and send secret messages. But that is not practical in many situations. That may not be possible, say. It's not a very technically solvable problem, because we need to have a mechanism to send the key as well. Then that can be a vulnerability there. A solution to this is what we call as public key cryptography. And with public key cryptography, what we have is we will have two keys. One is what we call a public key, and the other one is what we call a private key. So for each user will have their own public key and private key. And public key is shared with everyone. So I will give my public key to everyone. So public key is public. So then if you want to send me a message, you will lock it, you will encrypt it with the public key. Then when it is received, I will use my private key to unlock it. So anything that is locked by my public key can only be unlocked by my private key. So public key is for locking, encrypting, private key is for unlocking, decrypting. So I will share the public key with everyone. So no problem with that. So it is public. Anyone can take and encrypt a message and send it to me. I will have my private key with me all the time. So that is also secure. That is not shared with anyone. So then I can use that to decrypt the message. So now the problem of sharing the secret key is no longer there, because we are only sharing a public key that doesn't have to be secret, because the unlocking part, the decrypting part will be done by a separate private key. So that is what we call as public key cryptography. So this is the mechanism that is used in a lot of applications. That is the most common cryptography application that we would come across. And even in a lot of messaging applications, instant messaging applications, this is being used. So I have attached a couple of YouTube video links here for you all to get a bit more understanding about the concepts of these two. But basic idea is this. So what we would have here is, say if you want to send a message, send a plain text across, what we would start with is, we would start with our plain text. So we are starting with our plain text here. So that is what we are starting. Then for the purpose of encryption, we will use the public key. So public key is available with everyone. So anyone who wants to send a message can use this public key. Then that would be converted into the ciphertext as we want. So the ciphertext will be converted from the plain text will be converted into the ciphertext. Then at the receiving end, what we have to do is we have to take the decryption with the private key. So that is only we will have that. Nobody else can have that. And then we can generate the plain text message again. So the decryption part will do that. So because only one party is having the secret key, no issue about sharing that. So that can be kept private key. And anyone who needs to send can still use the key, because that is public key. So this is a very sort of elegant solution to do this encryption by others, so encrypted communication. So this type of a communication approach is very much used in many communication mechanisms. So, and this is one of the common things that you would encounter when you are thinking about cryptography. And another cryptographic sort of approach, sort of something similar to cryptography, is what we call as digital signatures. So these are also some things that would be used in a lot of communication, a lot of systems that you would come across. So the basic idea behind this is, again, we are using some mathematical functions, but what we do here is we will start with our plain text, our documents, whatever the document that we need to send, and then we would put it through a hash function. So a hash function will generate a text output that is not going to be a larger, so it's not like encryption, it is not going to have the file itself, but it is just a representation, a hash representation of it. So then we will generate, say, a small text representation for that, and anytime this file is put through this hash function, it will always generate the same output. So that is the nature of that mathematical function. So then when we are transmitting that to someone else, we can send the original document and then we can send the hash as well. So when they receive, they can compare these two things. They can use the same hash function and generate the hash and compare if they have actually received the same thing. So this is again a type of a mathematical approach similar to cryptography, digital signatures. Cryptography is mainly useful in the context of confidentiality because it will make sure that nobody else can read it. So it will ensure the confidentiality of the data. Digital signatures is mainly about integrity of the data, because if we can ensure this is the hash, then unless somebody changes this file, the hash will be the same. So if you are downloading a setup from the internet, and if they have provided a hash, then you can compare after it is downloaded to make sure the actual file downloaded is the same thing as they published. So it is a way of ensuring the integrity of the data. Cryptography is more about confidentiality. Digital signatures are more about integrity of data. So finally, when we think about security, one of the fundamental problems that we are going to have is not the technical problems, but also the users, the humans, and people who are not aware of the potential challenges of the systems, potential vulnerabilities of the systems. Then they can be one of the biggest part that can be exploited. So one of the ways that we can sort of systematically we can solve is by defining, so by giving limited access to people. So when we are doing access control, not giving every access to everyone, we limit the access to smaller cases. So not a lot of information can be exposed by those users accidentally. So that is one of the main issues that we have to consider, the users. So the technical problems will have technical solutions, like if there is intrusions, we can have intrusion detection systems and so on. But if a user is going to randomly email their username and password to someone else, then that is something that we cannot easily prevent using a system mechanism. So those are some of the things that we have to consider by considering what are the nature of users that we have. Then another thing that we will have to consider is between the ease of use and the security. If we make it easy to use the system, then we may not be able to implement the same level of security. If we make it more and more secure, then it may be more and more difficult for its users. So then we have to again find a balance in that. to achieve the level of security that we need in that particular computing environment, and then making it that much easy for users. So we don't have to build every system at a higher military grade security requirement. Certain things may not require that level of security. So we can find the trade-off between the security and ease of use. So that is what some of the things that we have to discuss in terms of security. And as I said, this is a basic discussion into security, just introducing you to various sort of concepts, various topic areas relevant to security that you may have to be aware of, and then you can do a bit of self-studying, and maybe some of these will be covered in later courses as well. But security, given it's a fundamental requirement in any computing environment, that is something that you need to be aware of, at least in the level that we have covered today. And given that we have covered a lot of these topics today, a lot of the potential vulnerabilities and possibilities of attacks, now you can be safely paranoid about everything that is happening around you, around your computer system. Other than that, that's all we have to cover in today's lesson. Are there any questions from things that we have covered so far?
No, sir.
All right. So if there are no particular questions, we may conclude the lesson for the day. And as I said, we may have a quiz next week, and I will share all those details. I will send a message, and I will post the details on LMS as well. And in the meantime, as always, if you have any questions, doubts, you can always contact me. So until next time, thanks for joining in today's lesson. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.